All right. You guys can hear me all right? Back over there? Cool. So I had to put the Jules Verne like to the moon thing because we know Ethereum's going to the moon and all that. So, kind of joke there. But thank you for having me. My name is Arpit Mathur. I work for, like Ryan mentioned, Ben mentioned, I work for Comcast. I also, you can find me on Twitter at that little moniker there. But yeah, for the last few months, I've been looking at blockchain technologies in general. I'm actually terrible at money things, but I got really interested in the smart contracts and the technology of the blockchain ecosystem a couple of years back, and so I've been playing with that a bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about smart contracts and how you can use them to build web apps. Just before we start, and just to kind of get an idea of the room, like how many people here would consider themselves technologists or developers, like software engineers? Cool. Okay, so like a fraction of it, and like JavaScript people. Okay, Rails people. Okay, so this is this is what I was like kind of. I just want to get an idea of the room because the audience of these presentations is very diverse. It's very interesting the community that's coming together. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about decentralized applications. And if you're an engineer, you'll kind of recognize roughly this stack, this technology stack, where this is how we build apps today, right? Like we have full-on platforms like Google and Amazon, AWS, and a lot of them provide some kind of identity system. You can sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook. There's a commerce engine. You can like buy through Stripe or something, and then processing layer, again, we go back to like a kind of a cloud infrastructure. And then you have like file systems and databases where you store the information for your application. And this is like this is a mauled version of a diagram I saw online. So if you disagree with it, it's not my fault. But this is the new decentralized application stack. And this is kind of where we're hopefully, I feel we're going, right? In a way, like the entire ecosystem of technologies that kind of was all mushed together or has kind of consolidated into some big players is kind of being torn apart again. And there are a lot of technologies to choose from where you want to build your applications. You have full-on platforms where you can like just deploy your code and your set, like Block Apps and ZeroNet. You have identity, which is coming from certain sites. This is an older diagram. I think Keybase changed their business model. I'm not sure what they are doing now, but Keybase was trying to be an identity platform for some point. You have Bitcoin and Ethereum providing a financial infrastructure for you anyways. You also have Ethereum and blockchains like Ethereum and Golem providing you compute. And then you have, under the hood, you have file systems like Swarm and IPFS. And so these are decentralized file systems that you can store the information and have it available to you. And even complete database technologies. And this is kind of a outshoot. These are not really they're not decentralized in a more typical sense, but like you can run like tools like BigChain and IPDB in your ecosystem. And you can take parts of this and kind of assemble your application, assembling this. So how do you build to this, right? And so the entire ecosystem of decentralized apps is now kind of starts looking like this, where you have your web application that you can host anywhere, and for some of the prototypes that I've done, it's just hosted on a typical like web server. But then all of your compute and all of your compute's happening on Ethereum, and all of your financial transactions are usually going through some wallet, right? Some middleman. If you want to build your own wallet into your JavaScript application, you can, but it's just better not to. This is actually the icons from a wallet called MetaMask, which is actually by Consensus. Consensus is a pretty known company in the Ethereum ecosystem, and yeah, so this is kind of the ecosystem there. Your app, at the lowest level, the way your app talks to the cloud is through something called JSON RPC. So it's JSON is this JavaScript object notation. It's kind of these like blobs of text that you're sending back and forth. It's a pretty low-level protocol, but the nice thing is there are certain JavaScript libraries that wrap JSON RPC, and you can basically use like higher-level functions. So instead of trying to like figure out what the exact sequence of calls was to kind of run a contract, you just say like contract.run or something like that. What's interesting with MetaMask, if you're using MetaMask, MetaMask will actually inject a Web3 JavaScript object into the browser, completely configured. So the JavaScript that your application is using to actually trigger, to actually start a payment process, you just say .pay or something like that, and MetaMask will take over the flow. And it'll bring up a transactions, like your wallet in the about to send money mode, where it says, oh, contract address so and so wants to use, wants you to send X amount of Ether or whatever. And even at a higher level than that, I mean, and this is kind of like a pyramid. Like at the lowest level, you have RPC, and then you're like going out further and further away from the low-level things. But at the highest level, you can have some complete web development framework like Truffle. I mentioned Rails. Like even if you're not familiar with the actual technology, Rails is a pretty well-known web development framework, and Truffle is like a web development framework for blockchain technology, for blockchain-based apps or decentralized apps. And it actually has the same amount of kind of utility functions there. So I'll quickly talk about some of the tools you end up needing when you're trying to build a Hello World blockchain dApp, decentralized app. The first thing that you probably will need is some kind of test environment. And there's this tool called Ganache. It also comes from Consensus, which lets you run a local test environment, a local test blockchain. It has a very, very pretty UI, and I'm a sucker for pretty UI, so I'm like, this is totally the thing you should do. But this is kind of a little bit of a chunk of code on how it works. So you actually configure it with the port, the accounts you want to preset, gas price, et cetera, and then you say run, right? And this is actually just JavaScript, and you say, okay, I'm listening on a particular port, and now you have a local test net running. The development process, basically, you build and test on your local machine, then you deploy it somewhere. It's usually, one of the main test networks or something like that. But you can go far with just building your applications on Ganache, or using Ganache. Oops, sorry. So Truffle, like I mentioned, Truffle is a Rails-like framework for Ethereum-based apps. What's really nice is Truffle comes with these things called Truffle boxes. And Truffle boxes are like pre-configured projects. So if you want to say, I want React's a very popular web framework these days. A JavaScript client-side framework these days. And Truffle has a React starter box, right? So you say, unpack Truffle React, and it'll actually set up a project that looks like this. For the more technical here, you can see some top-level folders. You have your contracts, which is basically the code that you're going to run on the blockchain. In your contracts folder, and then migrations, which basically is a record of when you deploy your contract to the blockchain. And then everything else here is your front-end code, right? So that's Truffle framework in a box. The contracts themselves are not written in JavaScript. You have to use something called, you can use it, there are a couple of different languages for smart contracts, but the one that's most popular is Solidity. So you can have a bunch of different IDEs for Solidity. Like you can write Solidity code in your text editor. But if you're learning Solidity, you should probably try this Remix IDE, which is at Ethereum. It's a web IDE hosted at ethereum.org. What's really cool is you basically write your contract here, and all the tools to compile, run, deploy, debug are right there. Right, so the way we have done stuff, we've actually just like written our entire contract on Remix, and then copy pasted that into the final version. Now there are ways you can always get a more native IDE, but we found this to be very useful. And then finally, the last part of the puzzle is the MetaMask wallet, right? Like in fact, if you look at, there's a website called State of the dApps, and if you look at it, it basically is archiving a bunch of web apps that are decentralized web apps, and almost all of them I've tried are dependent on MetaMask, even though there's no real I mean, you can actually trigger any kind of wallet, but MetaMask is so I guess universal. I mean, you can't even buy CryptoKitties without MetaMask. It's that big a deal, right? So like I said, MetaMask comes in as a Chrome extension. You install it. Comes up with this nice little fox. Again, another consensus project. And like I said, it injects these JavaScript objects into your browser, so you can actually call functions on. You can call, blockchain functions or methods on the blockchain, and MetaMask will intercept it and actually do the right thing. What is a contract? We've all heard of the smart contracts, and I've told you how to deploy it. This should have been somewhere ahead of there. A smart contract is actually just a piece of code, and if you've ever done JavaScript 101, this should start looking very familiar. But in any object-oriented code, you have these classes. Instead of classes, in Ethereum, you have, or in Solidity, you have contracts, right? So this is a Hello World project that comes with Ethereum, with Truffle. But it's a very simple storage contract that lets you store like an integer in memory. So the keyword contract defines that this is a contract. I have two functions. Both are public, which means they can both be invoked from from a different wallet. Like basically, wallets make these calls again to the contracts and can invoke these functions. And you have some other random terms. So for example, view means this is not changing the state. So Ethereum can do some optimizations. Another keyword here is value. So this function is going to be invoked from a different wallet address. When a wallet makes a call to a contract, it sends a bunch of metadata as well as like whatever function it's trying to invoke. So the metadata includes the wallet's own address and value, like Ethereum that it wants to attach to the message. And so your contract, when it runs, it can say, hey, who called me and how much is he sending me? How much money is he sending me? Oh, and I'm going to take a fraction of that money, hold on to it, and move the rest of the money around, or just consume all of it, or whatever. So these functions are invoked with Ether, with attached Ether, or they can be. In this case, both of them have no Ether value attached, so like you can run them for free, as long as you can, as long as you have the right gas price. So the workflow for creating web apps or decentralized apps: you create a contract in Solidity. You move your contracts to your contract directory in your Truffle project. You compile your contract, and then run Ganache, the local testnet. Deploy your contract. I think this should be Truffle migrate. And once the contract is deployed, you can import the contract. Truffle will give you a JavaScript object representing the contract. So you literally just say, import the contract from my contract definition, and now it's a full-on JavaScript object. It's like using any other JavaScript object. Execute the function in JavaScript. If you're ever going to, and every time you actually execute a function, MetaMask will come in and say, hey, how much gas do you want to attach to this, and how much Ether do you want to attach to this? And you can profit, right? But like this is kind of how CryptoKitties and all these new apps are being built. If you haven't read about CryptoKitties, you totally should. It's a fascinating project, and they've made a lot of money, and they completely use this framework. Or well, they use some framework, but they use this workflow. So here's my final page with some links. You can get Truffle from truffleframework.com, Solidity that's the documentation site, and MetaMask from there. That's it. Have time for questions, or?
A few questions, and Arkad, if you could just repeat any questions that are asked for the recording.
Okay. Yeah.
So, with your background, then, what are some use cases that you're looking at trying or that you're able to talk about?
I don't know. I'm still exploring what blockchains can do. But yeah, you can imagine. I think what people do with blockchains is still being explored at a very broad level. So we're just looking at it from a technology point of view. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas or suggestions for starter apps to build that are a little more complicated than just throwing a value?
The Hello World. So you can always create your ERC. Sorry, yeah. So the question was, are there any good examples for starter projects using this entire framework, this entire setup? You can always create your own ERC 2021, the tokens, your own custom tokens, and it's really exciting to see them, appear in your, Geth wallet or whatever. That's always good. A friend of mine and I were actually ripping through like the state of the apps, the state of the dApps site, And there's some really interesting ones. We totally wanted to do, now who remembers this? The $1 million homepage. You remember that one? So $1 million homepage, for those who are not in the know, was this page like early 2000s that was 1,000 by 1,000 pixels big, and the guy sold every pixel at $1. And he said, oh, you know, why not, right? Like, if anyone wants to buy a pixel, they can. And you could, like, he would place your pixel there. So you would buy these really small ad units and put them there, and they would each cost like $200 or something. And that page is packed, like he made $1 million, right? And we're like, oh, we totally want to do that, but with like blockchain, because you could then resell your pixels, you'd buy it ahead of time or something. So there are a lot of these crazy ideas out there, but yeah, make a game, make a tic-tac-toe game. I don't know, that might be fun. So, cool. I think going good?